All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by the Social Finance Thematic Interest Group of the American Evaluation Association. My name is Miriam Tardif-Douglan. I'm the Associate Director of Program Evaluation at the North Carolina Healthcare Foundation. To help us get to know one another, if you could rename yourself to include your organization, please do so, or just put your affiliation in the chat if that's easier. For those of you who are not familiar, the American Evaluation Association is a professional association of evaluators who are devoted to the application and exploration of evaluation as a profession. We have about 6,000 members in AEA representing all 50 US states, as well as approximately 80 foreign countries. The Social Finance Thematic Interest Group, known as the SIF-TIG for short, is a group of the AAA members who are interested in the topic of social impact measurement and management, and also exploring the interplay between the social and the financial return on investment. We come from many backgrounds, from evaluators to evaluation commissioners, investors, investees. Membership in our TAG means that you're interested in learning more about social finance, evaluating the social impact of organizations that are aiming to produce both a social and a financial return. Whether you're at the forefront of this work or just getting into it, all are welcome. And I'll note that each webinar in our 2026 series touches on the AEA conference theme, which is evaluation across boundaries. We have a very exciting webinar today focused on the results of a recent survey on careers in impact measurement and monitoring. Without further ado, I'll introduce today's speakers, Caitlin Rosser and Genevieve Edens. Caitlin leads Calvert Impact's IMM efforts, including managing how they define, measure, and manage impact and report to internal and external audiences. She brings nearly 15 years of experience in impact and performance measurement. Caitlin studied M&E in grad school and then got her IMM start through internal promotion. Genevieve leads on impact at Water Equity. In that capacity, she develops policies and tools and is involved in all stages of the investment process. She also brings 15 years of experience in impact management and research. Genevieve got her IMM start at a social enterprise and a field building organization. As a note, before I turn it over to Caitlin and Genevieve, we ask that you please save your questions for after the presentation. You are, however, welcome to post questions in the chat during the presentation. They just might not be answered until the end. Genevieve and Caitlin, turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Miriam. And a huge thanks to the Social Finance TIG for having us here today. We're really excited to be here with this group particularly, this group of both evaluators and IMMers together to discuss some of our findings from the research we did last year. Just a little bit of housekeeping, like Miriam mentioned, feel free to put questions in the chat. Since Genevieve and I will be like tag teaming throughout the presentation, we will try to monitor the chat and see if there's any questions that are super relevant for the particular slide, then we'll answer them. We will also have a good amount of Q&A at the end and some discussion pauses throughout the presentation as well. So lots of opportunities for folks to jump in and not only ask questions, but really share your perspectives too. We're really hoping to hear from you. But before we get too far into it, Genevieve is going to kick us off with a poll to learn a little bit more about who we have on the webinar today.
Thanks, Caitlin. So we just were curious who's in the room. We can help direct the conversation better if we know who you are, and it also gives context for some of the slides that we'll be sharing. So if on your screen, you should see a link to slido.com. You can either use the QR code with your phone and answer the question, or you can go to slido.com and enter the number to fill out the poll. I can see some responses coming in. We got 50-50 asset manager and nonprofit with 2 people responding. We'll just give it another couple minutes. So it looks like, even now with 8, 9 people responding. Most people work for a nonprofit in this room. And then some consultants, um, followed by some of the other types of organizations. I think as you'll see, that reflects the kind of diversity of organizations that house IMM professionals. But I would say that the sample that we surveyed isn't so skewed towards nonprofits. So I think that reflects the TIG's composition. So one more question. We're curious what field you would say that you're currently working. Would you say that you are monitoring, evaluation, learning, or an M&E or an evaluation professional? Would you say you're an IMM professional? Would you say that you're both or neither? I'm not surprised to see that both is top of the list. Oh, IMM jumps to the top. Um, that's, me coming from a non-evaluation background, I would not call myself an evaluation professional, although I have learned so much actually from AEA. I really myself feel more like I'm an IMM professional, but again, not surprised that the both is top here and neither, 33%. Very intriguing. We'll have to learn more in the discussion. So I'm actually going to hand it back to Caitlin to talk through the survey.
Excellent. Thank you, Genevieve. And it's great to see the composition of folks in the room. Like Genevieve said, it kind of somewhat mirrors the research study, and sometimes it's some dimensions look completely different. So excited for the conversation. I want to take a step back and just talk a little bit about our research goal before we jump into a bit of the findings. Genevieve and I embarked on this mission, this journey really to study IMM teams and how the IMM function is staffed within asset management firms, both of us coming from asset management firms ourselves. But before we could get to that, we knew we needed to know more about who was leading these teams, who's working in these teams, who are we going to be surveying? You don't just walk, especially as independent researchers, we knew we couldn't just, kind of launch a survey about IMM teams, particularly if we wanted to differentiate it from some of the current research out there. So we knew we needed to learn more about who we were researching, who we were working with first. What are their constraints? What are their pain points? Really key question, how much of the field is made up of early career professionals versus mid-career or senior career professionals? So we really started on this first piece of research on IMMers themselves as individual professionals. We did have another goal as well, and that was to study career paths of IMM professionals for a couple of different reasons. A big one to be offering some insights to some of the professional organizations out there within IMM and impact investing, those responsible for organizing the field, training new entrants to the field, certifying professionals, and really, with the ultimate goal of trying to professionalize this function, trying to professionalize the field of IMM. A lot of us come from so many different places, so many different paths, and there is not one, body that says this is what it takes to be a credentialed, credible IMM professional. So that was another goal of the survey. Although we won't get into those results too much, we will share the full results of the survey at the end. We do have a lot of results, so much that we can't cover in this one webinar alone. So we did decide to focus on a few key areas for this particular conversation, and then also bring in some new data on how some of the responses differed between those respondents with monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We'll abbreviate that as you saw before with Mel, versus maybe those who jumped right into IMM that didn't come from any kind of evaluation background. So a little bit more about the respondents. We did this research, as you can see on the slide, over 6 weeks. The middle of last year, we received 126 responses. And some of which maybe shouldn't be so surprising, but some of the results that were surprising to me is that we did receive a lot of responses from mid and senior career professionals, who had on average 16 years of professional experience, 8 years of IMM experience in particular. So that tells you as well that, not every person or, most people that responded to the survey actually had a kind of a prior career before joining IMM. But that being said, we did have a lot of responses from those who are field builders, independent consultants, held early career titles. And so it was a pretty decent breakout of the field. It wasn't just, mine and Genevieve's peers, which we were happy to see a good diversity of responses. So let's pop into the next slide and get a little bit more into the results themselves. Really at the maybe the 10,000 foot level, some of the key insights we saw in the data, we've talked about this already, is that there's no single career path to IMM, which is so different from so many other fields and really different from, say, our kind of largest counterpart within impact investing, which is the investments team. There's pretty typically a standard career path if you want to join a portfolio team or an investments team, and that's just not the case within IMM. So many IMMers come from MEL, they come from ESG, they come from consulting. Maybe they do come from finance. Maybe they do have an investment background. And so that was really, really clear in the data. What was also really clear in the data is that most respondents really love their jobs or like their jobs. There was a good degree of professional satisfaction, which we'll get into a little bit more, but a real call for more growth opportunities. So it was a real satisfaction with day-to-day job responsibilities, but a yearning for more growth opportunities. We also got into both personal constraints and organizational constraints. Some of the biggest personal constraints were technical expertise, particularly in regards to climate investing, as well as data. And we'll unpack that a little bit more as well. And then some of the top organizational constraints were the systems to manage data, the people to manage data, human resources, and then the budget to manage all of this data that we are responsible for. And then we did ask respondents for career advice, particularly geared towards earlier stage professionals, because we knew that would be of interest to a lot of folks as we disseminated the findings. And really the kind of through line in the advice was to, continue building your technical capabilities, network, network, network. I mean, we've all heard that before. And then keep learning. And that's what I love in particular about like the MEL title is that emphasis on learning. You've got the L, for learning in there. And that's often maybe not forgotten, but it's not explicit when you think about IMM, at least in terms of the field nomenclature. And as we talked about before, it's kind of brilliant. There's no one way to get into IMM. And so that means there's lots of opportunities to do so. But before we go too far down the kind of personal career path, professional satisfaction, Genevieve is going to walk through a little bit more of that kind of MEL respondent experience versus the IMM respondent experience and go through some of the data differences we saw there.
So in our original survey summary, the results summary, we actually didn't pull out MEL as a category that we were analyzing, but for this audience, it made a lot of sense. So we did a qualitative analysis on the path that people said they came from. So this was not like a multiple choice question. So take it with a grain of salt, but the qualitative responses pointed to almost 40% of the survey respondents coming from a monitoring and evaluation or a MEL or an evaluation background. As Caitlin mentioned, the remainder were kind of a combination of ESG or sustainability consulting or finance, like starting in finance and then transitioning within the firm to an IMM role, or some kind of management consulting. So, but really the biggest category were the MEL professionals. And for them, most of them landed their first IMM job at a field building organization or at a DFI. So not totally surprising, but really helpful to see that in the data. So instead of starting right at like a asset manager, they were either working for a DFI where evaluation is actually a job title that you can have, or they were working for a field building organization that is often trying to set the standards. So developing the technical framework for how to do IMM. They then, in their current role, actually, the majority said they were currently working at an asset manager. So I'm going to show the next slide. So this might be a little bit hard to read, so I'm going to walk through it. So we tried to pull out kind of where do people say their first job was in IMM and where are they working now? And you can see a combination of on the left, those people with a male background, and then on the right, the people with a non-male background. So the people with the evaluation background, and the size of the bar is the number of respondents, so the count of the respondents. So most often field building organization, a DFI, followed by an asset manager. Now, most of them are with an asset manager. You can see that actually there's quite a few in consulting, DFI, and field building is a much, much smaller part of that pie. So people do seem to sort of start at a field building organization and then move on. That's actually my own background. So I started at a network organization. I learned a lot about the space. I met a lot of people, did a lot of networking, and then now I work at an asset manager. So it seems very familiar. The non-male background people, by contrast, most often started at an asset manager. So maybe they came in with that finance background, for example. And then second would be consulting, followed by field building. And you can see that the non-male background it's much less common that they're with a DFI, for example. And it's much less common that they're currently at a DFI and also a field building organization. So you can see the kind of the difference in the profiles and the skills and how those pathways evolve. And I see a
Genevieve,
question.
we have a ton of questions, like validation, amazing visual, etc. And then, yeah, what did you use to create the visual?
It was 100% Claude. I can't take any credit. You can't do it in PowerPoint or Excel, and I can't code. So it was thanks to AI. But I did check the data, and I set up the data table myself. So the visualization is Claude, the data analysis is human. Um, So people start in this sort of like field building or DFI space most frequently. They're currently in asset managers most frequently. They're also often the leaders of the IMM function at their organization. So um, over 3/4 of respondents with the male background said they currently lead the IMM function, and that's compared to 2/3 of respondents from a non-male background. So most of our survey respondents, as Caitlin mentioned, were senior and most led the function, but those male background respondents were more often the IMM leaders. They also have more years of experience on average than the non-male respondents in the survey. So again, we're not claiming that this is like a representative sample of the field as a whole because we solicited responses essentially through our network. But I do think it indicates kind of that difference between the male and the non-male background. As Caitlin mentioned, we asked about key strengths that people felt that they had and also their own personal gaps that they felt like they had. So where they felt like they had personal strengths that were important to their role. They said analytical thinking, strategic thinking, and that was across the board. But male respondents more often also said research. So research in the IMM function might be thinking about the evidence base for a particular type of product. For example, I know that people without experience reading academic papers might really struggle, or maybe before AI really struggled to synthesize that. And that's something that evaluation professionals could bring as a strength. Key gaps were also similar between male and non-male professionals. So technical expertise came up most frequently, followed by data analysis and data management. It was more common for male professionals to have like the fourth category also be, I think it was like a slightly more common for them to say data analysis and data management, but it was common across the board. So there wasn't a huge difference there in terms of background. And we're going to dive a little bit more into that technical gap. I mean, you might think, well, technical, that's where evaluation professionals come in with strengths because they really understand the technical, they have their technical chops when they're coming to IMM. I think the way that respondents interpreted this was not the IMM skills, rather it was the sector specific skills that were missing. So most people said they came in and they were IMM generalists. And when you start at a firm, you have to become a sector specialist because usually your firm has a couple of sectors that they're focused on. It could be housing, it could be healthcare, it could be, in my case, it's water. I came in with no water background or very little water background. So I knew how to do IMM. I did not know anything about water. So you have to like learn about an entire field that some people have their entire career in, as well as being the expert in IMM. And you have to figure out how to build those skills on the job. Climate is one that people have their entire career figuring out how to do greenhouse gas accounting and how to think about emissions avoided. And so as an IMM professional, that might be a piece of what you do, and you have to figure out how to build those skills for yourself in addition to the other work that you're doing. Another skill that people said that they felt like they personally were missing was financial and investment skills. And I think this is particularly relevant for those coming in with a male background. And the way that a couple people framed it is like, I can't speak the same language as my counterparts on the investment team. So I'm at a disadvantage in these conversations, and I need to learn all of the how deals are structured, how they're negotiating, and how they're put together. And so learning those technical skills was another piece that people were pointing to. And then other skills included other sectors like agriculture or energy, healthcare, data management, and AI came up as well. And some people also said IMM frameworks and standards. So that was a piece of that technical skills that people wanted to build, but it was certainly not the most common one. We also saw communication and leadership come up, kind of related to how does the impact team think about their influence within the decision-making process, or how do you influence a deal? I think both the kind of soft skills of leadership and communication are super important there, as well as being able to speak the language of the financial team. And I'm going to hand it back to Caitlin unless there's any questions that popped up. Okay. All right, Caitlin, over to you.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't see anything that popped up. So great. Alrighty, so we've talked a little bit about the personal constraints that we identified with some of our respondents, and I want to talk a little bit about the organizational constraints that we identified. One of my hypotheses is that those smaller organizations, because we did ask about asset size for each of for your employer organization for each of the respondents. I was thinking smaller organizations would have more constraints overall, but that was not the case. All of the respondents in the survey identified some kinds of restraints. They did differ by asset size in a way, though, in unsurprising ways. Smaller organizations had more constraints overall, particularly HR budgets, both HR budgets and kind of budgets overall. The systems to manage data were identified as a major constraints. And then within larger organizations, the constraints were more interpersonal. So a little bit more, internal influence, getting senior leadership buy-in, as well as investments team buy-in, and that communication piece that Genevieve talked about before. There's lots of really just like fantastic quotes from our respondents all throughout the survey. We've got some here. We offer some in the slides here, and then when we send the full findings, you can find a lot of them there too. But one I really want to land on is that third one there, this perception of advanced IMM as too academic for particularly asset owners and asset managers to dedicate resources to. There's this real tension in both small organizations and large organizations with those in the IMM field of not wanting to take up, and gum up too much of the investment process, particularly in due diligence. And so how do IMMers, there's this tension, they have to walk this line, all the time between um, diligencing enough to feel comfortable with the impact of the investee or the data that they're analyzing, understanding that they're not going to have perfect data. And then and I think this is really relevant for evaluators, there's a real tension between um, performance data and maybe output and outcome data and actual evaluations. Most impact investors, and this is where I'm editorializing a little bit, most impact investors cannot dedicate or do not dedicate resources to actual rigorous evaluations and studies and research. It is using performance data around outputs and outcomes. And so there's a real tension, particularly within asset management firms, about utilizing, the data that we have and not kind of going overboard in terms of the more rigorous evaluation of outcomes. And so something I definitely hope we get into in the discussion a little bit more. But let's move on a little bit to the next slide and go back to the individual. This is really more of a summary. Genevieve has kind of walked through a lot of these findings. A lot of folks with a male background were more likely to start in a field building or standard setting organization, be categorized as a consultant or a specialist. They were more likely to indicate that they lead on IMM. In fact, 10% more those with a male background identified that they led on IMM versus their counterparts that did not have an evaluation background. And they were more likely to indicate that their current roles required them to be both IMM generalists and have some kind of specialization. So something that Genevieve talked about before. And this third finding really surprised me. And so curious to put this back to the group. If we were to study this finding a little bit further, one of my questions would be, do those that have a male background get more technical training? They come from this more rigorous, oftentimes academic background. And so when they do move into an asset manager or an asset owner um, situation or environment, are they more likely to lead on IMM within impact investing because they have this really rigorous technical background? And then similarly, because those with a male background are really just by nature of their work, they are required to have more of a sector specific specialization, expertise, geographic expertise. Are does that help? Does that influence as well? Particularly, if you look at the IMM counterparts, we're more required, and I say we because I'm a little bit more of the general IMMer, a little bit more required to be sector generalists, and then we learn about the sector specific specialization on the job, like Genevieve mentioned before. So those are a couple of my questions I'd love to study a little bit more. And so we thought we'd use this group as a little bit of a live test for some of these. Feel free to just unmute and jump in. I can try to pull up people as well if you do the raise hand function, either way.
I think that's a really interesting question. Both of those are interesting questions. And one thing that came to mind for me for the first question is those who are indicated they were in a leadership role. Did they say how many people they had reporting to them? Or was it sort of like you're the person who does this and you're therefore the leader?
Yeah, it's a great question. Genevieve, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't believe we asked how many people are reporting to them, and it was less about leading a team in terms of staff and more about leading the function within the investment firm, within the investment management process, being like the point person on IMM. Because a lot of times within impact investing firms, IMM is like a part-time job for someone or an extra job for someone. If they're working, it's like if they're working 120%, it's their extra 20%. And so it's really more about like who is the go-to person within the firm and less like are you leading the team in terms of staffing?
Got it. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, no worries.
I'm
Oh,
noodling
Laura,
on
yeah, please.
this. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
noodling on this first question about like whether it's about technical training. And I'm just speaking from like personal experience, which is less like a specific MEL training, but just more like having an MEL lead role in another organization is just probably the closest corollary that there was to an IMM lead. So I think it would kind of follow that if you were an MEL lead at one organization, that would kind of copy paste, not necessarily in practice, but on paper to an IMM lead at a at an impact fund. Whereas if you were doing it more part-time, or if you're kind of transitioning for another role, or if you were kind of a more generalist like strategy consultant, it wouldn't necessarily follow that you would be the top of the list for the IMM lead role. So I wonder if it has more to do with just like the corollary of like what the function looked like at your old job versus your new job. And the other thing I'm noodling on is like, is it really about like technical training and like whether they kind of came up through a very formal system of being like certified as an evaluator? Or is it that people who have been in MEL roles are kind of familiar with like scraping together a bunch of the different frameworks and conferences and talking to each other? Like they're kind of already plugged in and networked in the evaluation space. And so they kind of know where to find stuff and get get knowledge on IMM frameworks in a way that like if you were kind of new to the MEL space, you wouldn't necessarily know where to start looking for that stuff. So um, that's just anecdotal, but a good provocation.
That's kind of where my mind goes as well, Laura, because I certainly would not say that I have an evaluation background, but I studied M&E in grad school. And so like I at least was familiar with and used, theory of change and logical frameworks. And when I, came into this role at Calvert, I could draw from that, but it's not that I mean, I technically was certified in certain ways, but it's not like I was like a lead on MEL or MEL in a particular organization. I just like had some background to draw from, particularly 10 years ago when IMM within impact investing was still pretty new. And, Impact Frontiers didn't exist then. There was the Impact Management Project, and like that was kind of the main the main resource for IMMers within impact investing.
Yeah, I was just adding to the chat. I've
Yeah.
heard the term accidental evaluator a lot. Like I feel like MEL practitioner, like to arrive at MEL or evaluation is often a kind of circuitous, accidental path. And so IMM is just like the next frontier in that for many people who have already been there. So I don't know how linear or certified most MEL practitioners feel in their MEL roots.
It's a
Yeah,
really good clarification. Yeah,
yeah,
Courtney, come on in. Oh,
I
Laura,
can,
Laura, number two.
yeah, I completely agree. I know it's so funny. We just came from a call together.
Yeah.
I completely agree with what Laura just said. That's my experience as well. And also, I'm looking at this second discussion question you have here, and I actually think that MELers are a mix. There's a lot of people in MEL and evaluation that consider themselves, I mean, I call myself sector agnostic. Like you think of yourself more as a methodologist. You might specialize in a particular methodology, but not a specific sector or geography. There are some evaluators that do that. But I think there's also a large portion of the evaluation community that would actually align with the IMMers here in your research, where you're more of a sector generalist, but you're a methodologist. So I just wanted to clarify that too, just from our community.
Yeah, really, really helpful. And I think I probably come with a lot of assumptions on the professionalization of the evaluation field, mostly due to lack of intense familiarity with the field. And so it's helpful it's a helpful validation that like, we're all just kind of figuring it out as well and have our own roundabout career paths too. So let's pop into, unless Genevieve, you wanted to jump in on anything.
Well, I was one. I think we have maybe a little bit of time. I was wondering back to Miriam's question about like how many people does the leader manage in their role as the IMM lead? And my assumption is, oh, IMM professionals are often alone, so like they're a team of one or a team of 50%. And that can be challenging because you're trying to maybe grow your own skills by yourself, and so you have to kind of like find your network. But I'm curious if evaluators have the same issue, like if there is typically one evaluator at an organization, and so, or if it's different. I mean, I assumed, oh, this is like a difference with IMM, but maybe it's also the same as kind of that circuitous path.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to this a little bit. So, in evaluation, you tend to have like a few different versions of what that career looks like. So, sometimes like there's an internal evaluator at a nonprofit, or an NGO, and in those situations, you are often the only evaluator. So especially for in the real nonprofit type of realm, like they don't have funding to hire big evaluation teams. There's usually one person. That person is usually trying to figure out on the job how they even do it. That's that example Laura was giving. So that exists. Then you have evaluation teams at foundations. Those tend to be teams. So you often have maybe a learning and evaluation team, and they kind of often overlap with strategy a bit, and then also like evaluation. They often are hiring in consultants, learning partners to do their data collection, so that they have sort of an external evaluation happening, but they have an internal team that coordinates that liaises between program teams and those learning partners. So those tend to be teams. And then you also have like a lot of evaluators exist either as independent consultants working on their own. Maybe they team up with a colleague for projects. And then you also have evaluation firms. Well, you'll have teams of evaluators working at those firms that are being hired as evaluation partners. So that's kind of like anybody else come in. That's my own personal how I think about the evaluation field, and what the different pathways are as a career in that world. But yeah, curious if others have things to add to that, what you've seen in the evaluation field, or your own experiences.
Courtney, I'll just say that that sounds very familiar. Like the small asset manager, team of one, large DFI, big team. Then you might cover impact and ESG and strategy. And then a consulting firm really focused on IMM, where everyone is an IMM expert of some kind, and you have a larger group, and then the independent. So that sounds like it really mirrors quite well the IMM experience.
Totally. Yeah.
Excellent. Genevieve, let's go to the next slide and then we can, or I'll land on this one super briefly. We have a couple of different slides that have a little bit more qualitative summary of the findings. We won't go through those now, but just, we put them on the slide here as an offering for when we circulate the slides later. So we can move into the next one and talk a little bit more about these constraints that individuals are facing. And maybe this is actually perhaps, maybe it's related to the previous discussion questions we brought up, but we found in the data that those with a male background were actually 2 times as likely to indicate that they have weak influence within their organizations. And given, how we just talked about the different evaluation roles within organizations, I think we could break this out a little bit more. We run the risk of like the data set getting so small that we're not really finding much meaningful. But that might be an interesting way for Genevieve and I to kind of take another look at the crosscut. But even just that was just so interesting, whether it's because we've got a couple of different hypotheses or kind of rationales we can think of, whether it's because those with a male background don't feel that they have the kind of finance chops to really speak the language, and maybe that's why there's weak influence. Is it because they're actually independent consultants. And, they're providing a service to, say a resource constrained organization. And so they don't feel like they've got a lot of influence into how their recommendations are going to be followed, because that's often the consultant's role, is to present, here's my recommendations, and then it's up to the organization to implement. Um, Whether it's for other reasons as well. I mean, I feel like I could go on and on. Is it about, their other elements of their background? Is it about organizational size? So yeah, and then coupled with that, those with a male background were also typically reporting lower job satisfaction, both in the two areas we asked about, both the day-to-day responsibilities and opportunities for professional growth. So would love to open it up to the group to see if there's any thoughts on why we might be seeing this in the data.
If I may comment, this is very interesting finding because I was wondering, listening to the presentation, what IMMRs are doing. For instance, IMM involve using the result measurement and evaluation finding to actually manage, right? To try to influence the operations and strategies and policies. While I think a male practitioner stop just providing the findings or evaluation result. But if you are working for IMM, particularly the second M area, you are in a position to use the evaluation results and actually work with operational colleagues and management to improve again policy strategies and projects. So maybe that's where the difference comes from. So IMM are not only doing the result measurement evaluation, but being involved probably more in the management side. I don't know. Thank you.
I love that. It's such a fundamental understanding assumption, to call out about the differences in the roles. Evaluators really are there to evaluate the effectiveness of a program, versus IMMers are typically, there are IMM consultants, but they're typically, on staff working hand in hand with the investments team to not only measure the impact, but like you said, Ichiro, manage the impact and then influence kind of strategy all the way from the beginning, and really engage in this cycle of learning. Such an astute observation.
But at the same time, just that I've been wondering whether that really happening, whether IMM practitioner really include the management role, or it is more like theoreticals, and then in the end, IMM practitioners ending up being the same, doing the similar role as male practitioners. So I'm just very curious about. But if the difference really comes from the fact that some of the IMM practitioners are already taking the management role, and then that's great.
That's a whole other webinar as well. Is how do we use the management part of IMM more effectively? Yeah, Juhi, please.
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't agree with you more, Ichiro, with your observations. And just thinking the tension between how IMM is embedded into the investment process fully versus does it work kind of separately, independently as a siloed evaluation approach. But that also goes with, is IMM a tool for decision making versus is IMM about evaluating and monitoring post-investment? And one kind of comment or feedback I've heard from the field is when IMM is driven from kind of evaluation perspective, it tends to be academic, not as practical when portfolio managers have to make decisions that's integrated with kind of financial decision making, but also in a much more kind of iterative, proactive way. So I'm curious to hear from male background professionals, like, is that a shift to go from deeper academic independent evaluation framing, which is super helpful in like strategy and theory of change development, kind of early stages and the back end stages. But then there's the actual investment cycle. Like, is that a shift to make what you know from Mel, like very applicable and practical in an efficient way for investment decision making, or is it kind of something that's easily adaptable?
Yeah, Laura, you want to pop in? I don't know if your comment was in relation
Yeah,
or something different.
it is. It's in some ways responding to Juhi. So I think one thing that we talk about a lot in the social finance TIG, and many of us have like written blogs about it and hosted roundtables about it, is the human component of IMM and this bridging role that IMM practitioners, MEL practitioners, whatever you want to call them, play. And because there are really two different languages being spoken, and not just languages, but like two different cultures that
Mm-hmm.
folks are operating in, and like worldviews and just frameworks that they're coming at. And that isn't just like oh, I don't really understand the words you're using, or this isn't really what I was taught. I don't have that same kind of set of skills. Sometimes it comes with like a deep skepticism of the value of what someone on the other side is bringing. And oftentimes it's the IMM person who either like represents the other side of that or is playing a bridging role between folks who are kind of social sector first versus finance first. And there's this sense of like, well, what you do isn't that valuable, or it's not that relevant to me, or I'm skeptical of it. And that I think actually is like under the surface of a lot of these, this finding of like they have weaker influence. Sometimes it has to do with some of these biases that people are bringing, and I think many of us who have worked in this space as bridging actors have worked really, really hard to overcome and bridge and try to build trust and respect across those groups. And I think in the cases where people feel most frustrated and feel like they have the least amount of influence is where they've like stuck so hard to like their old way of seeing things. And where I've seen teams really, evaluators or IMM practitioners within teams feel really frustrated and powerless is in cases where what Ichiro and Juhi have been saying, like the investment team sees what they're bringing as overly academic, as not very relevant, as like that comes from the philanthropy side, and we don't really do that over here. And the IMM practitioner is so stuck in like, but this is the right way to do evaluation, and I refuse to kind of bend to a new way of doing it. And I have to say that even in the evaluation MEL world, there was a little bit of a bifurcation between that. And in my last like several years in an MEL role, there was a push towards having MEL be a little bit more responsive and like tighter feedback loops, and like folks who are involved in like developmental evaluation, which is like, let's measure what emerges. Let's not stick to these like really, really academic, strict ways of doing things, and rather be a more part of the management of it all. And so we even saw that, and like even MEL practitioners were trying to kind of overcome the bias that evaluators were overly academic and irrelevant to the program teams, and trying to adapt their ways of working to be more dynamic and more responsive and more flexible so that program teams could use that data. So I feel like those folks who were doing MEL in that more adaptive, flexible way maybe made that leap to IMM, to investment, more easily than those who were like continuing to do it in a more academic way, which has a role and has a place, but isn't necessarily the flavor that financial professionals are loving all the time. That's my piece.
Absolutely. No, Laura, and you basically like perfectly encaptured, some basically like my final thoughts and reflections on this too. So Genevieve, maybe we can just land on the next slide, just so folks see that it's there and you can dive into the data a little bit more. And then we can go into some final reflections, and then, whatever time we've got left, open up for more discussion. One of the um, yeah, so we
Yeah, sorry, do you
didn't
want to
want to
pause
just.
on?
This one's great. Yeah, let's land on this
Okay.
one because we didn't want to just talk. Genevieve and I, like, we're all in some way evaluators, performance management professionals, impact measurement. Like, we are always thinking about what can we do better. We're always very critical people, and we forget to like celebrate the positive sometimes. As much as IMMers, we find our role in like reporting and communicating positive data and great case studies from the portfolio. We're like by nature very critical people. And so we wanted to also just land on some of the positives we found in the survey. Overall, this is IMM, or this is the respondents overall, not the male versus IMM breakdown. But we still did see an overwhelming amount of professional satisfaction, both in day-to-day responsibilities and opportunities for professional growth in either the very satisfied or somewhat satisfied respondent categories, as well as some commonalities in what is driving that professional satisfaction. And then kind of moving into some of my final thoughts, one surprisingly unsurprising, I did not anticipate this, but it is not a surprising finding. One of the drivers of this job satisfaction is an opportunity to really build this new-ish field, called IMM. And that building, helping to build that best practice across the field is just a major motivator of professional satisfaction. And it's just not something that like we set out to study from the get-go. Although I think Genevieve and I both really, really hold that in our hearts. So it's funny we didn't build that into the research design. And then just reflecting what you were mentioning, Laura, there's this real tension within impact investing and especially within asset managers between the need for rigor and the need for speed and flexibility. Investors need to move fast and make decisions more quickly with imperfect data. And those, whether you consider yourself in MEL or IMM, you're seen as too rigorous, too rigid, too academic. We really risk not being well integrated into the investment process and just like called at the end when like you need to look at something, right before it goes to committee. You need to be partnering with the portfolio team, especially if we're talking about impact due diligence, partnering with the portfolio team, partnering with the investments team, understanding the investment process and the constraints of that kind of investment paradigm within the firm is really, really crucial. And then making sure that IMM is both kind of in lockstep with the investment process and has real buy-in, real relationship, real partnership, like you said, Laura, with the portfolio teams, and a real mandate from leadership as well is one of the major pieces I've seen where IMM is successful. So those are some of my final thoughts. I want to pass it back to Genevieve to offer some final thoughts and wrap up as well. I mean, we've had such a great discussion throughout. But if there's any questions or kind of final thoughts, we're more than happy to take them too. But back to you, Genevieve.
Thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, I'll just be really brief. There's a couple of questions in the chat, so I think we can get to some,
great.
if not all of them. So I would just echo what Caitlin said and then flag that opportunities for professional growth is the area where there's the least, like the lowest satisfaction levels. I am struck both by the fact that junior, like new entrants into the field are the most dissatisfied. And this question of like, what is the peak role? Like, where do you go within IMM once you're a leader of the function? Often you report up to a chief investment officer or a chief fundraising officer. So you may have to like switch out of your field if you want to keep growing within an organization. So we're thinking about how do you get into the field once you're in at an entry level? How can you build your skills and grow? And then how can you kind of maybe think about moving out to grow further and then coming back in? So I think it's definitely not linear, even once you're in. And I think it would be really interesting to continue this discussion. We're really interested in organizational structures. How are these teams structured within the organization? How are decisions made? And how does that affect you as a professional? How can you really influence the way the field is going, and also have some satisfaction in the work that you're doing? So those are my final thoughts. And there's a couple of questions. I'm just going to read out a couple that I saw. One was about the demographics of the sample and whether we looked at those. Another one, there's a sort of discussion about like global versus a US centric. Maybe I'll start with a demographic question, and then maybe Caitlin, you want to look for another question to answer.
Yeah,
So
that sounds great.
we did ask about gender and ethnicity and age. We did some crosstabs within the full results. So we'll, in the slides, there's a link to the full survey. I think Caitlin maybe has sent over a link. If not, I can do it in the chat.
I'll pull
We
it
did
now.
see
Yeah.
that like the majority of respondents were white women. That was overwhelmingly the case. And we looked at some differences in by gender and ethnicity and some of the satisfaction questions, for example. We didn't get into cultural competency, which I think is super interesting, but especially if you're working at a global organization and you're working across communities and you come with your own bias, having that communication skills and being able to work with people who are in diverse settings can be really important. Something we didn't dive into in the survey.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just reiterate and then answer some of the other questions probably in effect. We did not have a rigorous sampling methodology to get respondents. This was Genevieve and I sharing with our networks and posting on LinkedIn. And so understandably, the sample set is pretty biased towards our particular networks. It's not, literally everyone we know. There were plenty of respondents that I assume I don't know. But it's going to be a pretty biased sample set. Both Genevieve and I work for asset managers that are globally focused. So really in emerging markets. And so, our network just naturally happens to be a lot of other global asset managers, asset owners, DFIs. Calvert Impact has a pretty long history in the community development space here in the US. And so we do have a few community development practitioners who responded. But generally, it's going to be a lot more of a global data set. And I would agree with Denise, who put at least these respondents, and I think IMM in general, it's a little bit anecdotal, but IMM in general is likely more global than certainly the kind of US focused evaluation space. And we've got a couple of questions about training in there, and I know that there's some kind of back and forth on that, but I did post within like IMM, there is like one that is universally recommended by Professor Kathy Clark, who created it from Duke Fuqua's school. So I put that in the chat. And then we also put the full results in the chat. And I do think, maybe just a plug for the research that Courtney, Laura, and then another colleague, Catherine Dunn-Rappaport, are doing to kind of explore a potential new home for IMM. Certification and training has to be part of that. There are, it's scattered right now. It's scattered between like the UK CFA Institute. The GIN has some trainings. There's this online Coursera, but there is no like one credential that was really meaningful within IMM where you can look at and you can say, oh, this person did that training. They know what they're talking about, like you can in other professions. And so I think that is a huge necessary next step in terms of professionalizing the field as well. And yeah, Laura put the link to indicate your interest absolutely in there. So we're just really looking forward to yes, and Impact Frontiers definitely is a good point. It's not like one where like one individual can take the training. It's more organizational based. Genevieve and I are both founding alumnus, whatever the plural is of that, of Impact Frontiers. We joined the first Impact Frontiers cohort before it was Impact Frontiers, so huge supporters of their work. They've completely revolutionized the work that I do within Calvert Impact, and not speaking for Genevieve, but I'm sure would say the same. So that's another great resource. So thanks, Ida, for mentioning that. And I know we're only a minute over. Miriam, I don't know if there's any kind of final thoughts, or Genevieve also want to make space for you too.
Anything from you, Genevieve?
No. Thank you
Okay.
all so much for the conversation. It was so great to be able to do this today.
Yes, Caitlin, Genevieve, thank you so much for leading this webinar. I thought this was hugely informative. For everyone who's on the call, I will share the recording to everyone who registered, and then also on LinkedIn and YouTube. So thank you for attending, everyone, and for asking really thoughtful questions. All right, bye.
Thanks all.